we here by accident?
That's not a scientific question. That's a philosophical question. When you deal with the very cold or the very small, usually you need quantum mechanics. If you are interested in the universe and read about cosmology, you cannot do without Einstein. Disorder increases in time when you have a closed system. So there is a direction of time in thermodynamics which is not present in other laws of physics. So physics is the platform on which life and consciousness runs, but physics does not determine it. It enables it and provides all these possibilities for these things to happen. When you believe that the laws of nature and chance and matter are the ultimate reality, which explains everything else and which brings about everything else, then we are here by accident in the sense that there's nobody who wanted us to be here. Those people who did not want to accept the Big Bang were atheistic scientists because they wanted the universe to be eternal. And the message is God made the world for us. Fred Hoyle, who made this discovery, he was an atheist and he remained an atheist, but he said, it looks like it was done on purpose. And later he said, nothing shattered my atheism as much as this discovery. He still remained an atheist. I think this question about the fine-tuning, that's one of the arguments for God. And there are more questions of this type that are raised by science, but that science cannot answer. I think it's very scientific to know the limits of science. And scientific questions are not the only meaningful questions. The fact that there are laws of nature can tell us that God is reliable, that he is providing for us, that he wants us to be able to act responsibly. The resurrection of Jesus is the foundation of my faith. And I think that's clearly a violation of the law of nature that all of us die and remain dead. I became a Christian because I was searching for the meaning of life. Now, laws of nature are a difficult concept because, they're not something material that can have an influence by itself. So how can these abstract laws govern the world? What gives them the power? What makes matter obey these mathematical laws? Now, my answer would be God, and early scientists have given that answer. Somehow this answer is not very fashionable among philosophers of science.
The voice you just heard is that of Dr. Barbara Drossel, Professor of Theoretical Physics at the Technical University of Darmstadt. Hello, this is Matthew, and in this episode of Still Unbelievable, we'll be reviewing sessions 3 and 4 of the 2022 Christian Evidence Society sessions. These cover the questions of, are we here by accident, and is there life elsewhere? We also address an email that we received following our review of the 2021 session on race, so stick around to the very end for that. Links are in the show notes if you want to listen to the full sessions or find out more about the speakers. What struck us most about these two sessions is that there was a very definite separation of science and Christianity. Both speakers appeared reluctant to be drawn into discussing how science can evidentially justify belief in a God. They both affirmed a God, and they both expressed how science informs their belief. But specifics on how evidence indicates a God were distinctly lacking. This is a theme we regularly see when scientists discuss their Christian faith. And we're back, just Matthew and Darren here for this one. Andrew, unfortunately, had another engagement, so he was unable to join for the presentation. I don't know if he's going to have time to join for the questions, but Darren and I will plough on anyway. Right, so Darren, we had Barbara Drossel here answering the question about, are we here by accident? So that means physics, theoretical physics, quantum physics, laws of nature, Big Bang, start of the universe, all those juicy things that you and I and Andrew have munched over multiple times in the past. This one promised to be interesting, But I did flag up at the end of our last discussion that this lady, Barbara Drossel, is also associated with the Faraday Institute. And there was a link that came up as well right at the very beginning of the presentation about evidence for faith. So that rings alarm bells for me. I'm pretty sure it rings alarm bells for you. So pros and cons in terms of how this was presented and what it promised. How did it go for you?
I think I may have strained my eyes. There was a lot of eye rolling, and some of it wasn't gentle. I don't know if I had Barbara's CV in front of me. Her reasoning skills are so bad. There was no way I would ever hire her for pretty much anything.
Yeah, I think I pretty much called your reaction on that one. As is usual, I'm a little bit softer in my reaction, but I think deep down we had exactly the same reaction. There were various points in there where I thought to myself, Darren's not going to like that one. And I did think to myself, so I thought, as somebody who is both a serious scientist and a serious Christian, why did that phrase come out? And it reminded me of some of the poor conversations that I've seen on Facebook, and it reminded me of some of the criticisms that we have thrown at Christian philosophers. And it was unfortunate that this kind of language came out of somebody who's a scientist and a Christian. I was hoping for better.
Yeah, it pretty much, there were 2 points that pretty much killed it for me. The first was when she said that people presented the multiverse just because they wanted to avoid the God question. And then the second one was when she said that her faith tells her what to believe, and then whatever the evidence is, she just sort of tries to make it fit her faith, no matter what the evidence actually says.
Yes, I would match those two as my 2 low points as well. On the multiverse thing, I think what she actually said was the multiverse came out as a way to avoid the fine-tuning of the universe. And that is something that I've seen rolled out by what I would very unkindly say are armchair theologians on Facebook. It's not something that I expected somebody who actually studies this for a living to repeat that trope, because it's not accurate. It isn't an accurate representation of the way the science around the multiverse is presented. And her dismissal of it as well disappointed me, because scientists aren't supposed to dismiss out of hand things like that. They're supposed to talk about the data, and they're supposed to talk about the evidence, and they're supposed to challenge them with counter data, not just supposed to dismiss them out of hand because they don't believe them.
Yeah, well, the problem with sort of dismissing it in that way is that, because the math drives the multiverse
Yeah,
ideas.
and she denied that statement, because I'm assuming it was you who asked the question where somebody said in a question, the math drives the multiverse, and she basically flat out said, no, that's not the case in her answer to it.
Right. The whole thing of inflation, it actually drives the whole multiverse. The reason we have multiverse ideas is because of inflation. And inflation has been tested, and we know the math's pretty well behind it, and it all drives towards the multiverse. So for her to say that that there's no maths behind it, then she's either being dishonest about knowing that the maths drive it, or she doesn't actually study in the field and she's lying about that. Either way, she's being incredibly dishonest about the whole thing.
Yeah, that whole section I found really, really disappointed, because the one mantra is absolutely the wrong word to use in that, but I'll use it again. The one mantra that I do hear about this, and from people who talk about and know about it, is the mathematics at that level of physics does support the hypothesis of a multiverse. That's why the idea has lasted for so long, because it works with the maths at that level of quantum physics.
Mm-hmm.
If it didn't work, then the theory wouldn't have lasted very long.
Oh, right.
The hypothesis.
Yeah, if you take just quantum physics, the straight up math that makes it up, it actually the way it works is it actually has multiverse almost written into it. That's where Sean Carroll's version of the multiverse comes from, is straight from the math of quantum physics itself, the many worlds interpretation.
Yeah, so that was really disappointed. The other thing, though, to note about that is it's always the multiverse that gets attacked in conversations like this. The cyclic universe doesn't get attacked. Quantum loop theory doesn't get attacked by this. It seems to be because someone famous in a wheelchair who was apparently a scientist made it popular. That's the one that they attack all the time, relentlessly. It's almost like that's the one that they fear the most.
Yeah, well, the problem is that the multiverse actually has the strongest evidence to support it. Things like loop quantum gravity and the Big Bang or Big Crunch and shrinking and everything. All of those are speculative at best, and they sort of have the math. They can get some of the math to sort of support them, but they're not very strongly supported. Whereas the multiverse is, and I think that's why the multiverse is what normally gets glommed onto.
But you would hope that at least somebody of this level of knowledge or working in the field would at least have something that they could use to argue against it and not just say, I don't believe in the multiverse and rule it out at that.
Well, given her level of reasoning throughout the rest of it, I'm sort of not surprised. When she was directly asked the question, are we here by accident, which was what the whole thing was supposed to be about, she's like, well, if you're a materialist, then the answer is yes. But if you believe in God, then the answer is no. And I believe in God, so the answer is no.
She pretty much waved her flag at that point, didn't she?
Yeah.
The other thing she said about, are we here by accident? And I made it bold in my notes so that I wouldn't miss it. Which she said was, the question, are we here by accident, isn't a science question, it's a philosophy question. I thought, well, there you go then. It's settled. We can stop it right there, because if it's a philosophy question, then you're going to get a different answer for every philosopher that you ask, and there's no point in us munching it around. Let's just drink a pint of beer and go home. We'll have so much more fun afterwards.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and what were her reasons? She gave phenomena of consciousness can't be explained by materialism, which isn't actually true, but that's what Christians like to say. And then her longing for eternity. So, I mean, when that's her reasoning ability.
Yes, she did. That was the other point where she waved a flag, wasn't it? Where she straight up admitted that, let me just find this so that I don't. It was right near the end, wasn't it? Science doesn't answer questions like, does my life have meaning, my hope for eternity, and my hope for forgiveness? Those were three of the things she said about the interface between faith and science. And yeah, I'm very fine accepting those points aren't answered by science. But then at the same time, you don't really have much of a grounding to base those, because they then become what you desire, what your preferences are. And earlier in the talk, she admitted that preferences are subjective, science is objective. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you're now coming to the point of, that's my subjective preference to have those things in my life, and science can't answer them. Therefore, I need to accept some other hypothesis to answer those for me. And that hypothesis that I accept could be anything that I make up or something that I adopt from somebody else, but in no way at all can that ever be objectively measured, confirmed, or verified. And she wants to be taken seriously on that point as well as the science. I just don't see how, when you balance them in a set of scales of what should we take more seriously, how anything can balance against the raw might of objective science.
Well, yeah, I mean, but that's been sort of the theme throughout this entire series. What's his name? Nigel, the interviewer.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, Nigel's sort of been pushing this narrative from the very beginning that, science and religion are two different things, and science answers one set of questions and religion answers another set. And she was sort of harping on that as well today. And one of the examples she gave was that science can't, prove that she loves her husband. Of course, she's wrong about that. Stick her in an MRI machine and we can actually watch love in the brain, so we actually can sort of gauge not only does she love her husband, but how much compared to other people. So I don't know. It's just this weird thing that they know that they have no evidence for God. She said that several times. She just gave really bad, largely debunked apologist arguments for why she believes in God, and then so they know that that's all they have, so they have to try to carve out this exception for religion. The weird thing is that if they could prove God with science, they would be all over that.
Yep, absolutely. I'm going to make an attempt to rescue her reputation somewhat. There was a bit of honesty and humility halfway through, where answering the question of what challenges science has given to faith and how science has changed her opinion over time. She did say that in her 30s, she abandoned the idea of special creation and accepted and adopted evolution. So there was that in there. Does that raise your opinion of her at all?
Not really, because evolution has like 150 years of evidence, piles of evidence. It spawned 2 or 3 different fields of study all by itself. I mean, to deny evolution at this point is just to deny reality. So getting to the point where she's not quite willing to deny obvious reality doesn't really raise my opinion of her too much.
Okay, all right then. I'm going to try and fish a little bit more for some of that hard to find respect, but maybe this is all a scale of understanding. You know, the battle between special creation and evolution happened in the mind. I'm going to assume that it happened over a period of time. Hello, Andrew. Welcome. How are you, sir?
Muted is what he is.
He's muted. Okay, for the benefit of Andrew, who's just joined, I'll restart my answer or the lead run up to my question to Darren. So she said that in her 30s, she abandoned belief in special creation and adopted belief in evolution instead. And so I'm going to assume that wasn't an overnight job, that happened a little bit over time. Presumably, because it was in her 30s, she was already an adult, she was already a working professional, presumably already married, but that's not necessarily true or relevant. That happened, and then she was doing her work, and she had this internal battle about evolution. She decided that the science was for evolution, adopted evolution. Her faith and her theology must have had some kind of change as a result of that. And now she's carrying on her professional life. Maybe this is just one step into other things, and maybe taking the multiverse a bit more seriously is what happens in the coming years for her. It's not helping you at all, is it, Darren? You're just not there, are you? I can't rescue any respect, can I?
No, because I mean, she's flat out said that her faith comes first, and it doesn't matter what the evidence says. She's still going to believe her faith. I just no, sorry. I can't even.
Thank you guys for letting me join late. So my apologies. I
think Matthew's desperate for someone who's a little less pessimistic than I am.
Yeah, well, I owe Darren. I've clearly wrecked his evening. He obviously had much better and more important things to do, and I've completely ruined his night.
Thank you, Matthew.
I don't, Matthew. I don't have anything in my life more important than talking with you.
Oh, you're a superstar, you.
So, but I do wonder this. So, I was involved in a conversation on Nextdoor. If you guys are familiar with the app, it gets a bunch of people in your nearby area connected, right? It's Facebook.
Yeah. It's actually arrived in rural Somerset, so yeah, I'm familiar with it.
Okay, so you're familiar with it. So I had a conversation with someone the other day, and she said something about conservative voices being silenced in social media, and she'd written something that was a little snarky, and she insisted that she was going to be silenced, right, that her post would be removed. And I asked her, this is going somewhere relevant, I promise. I asked her if she wasn't silenced, if that new information that she could actually say things and she wouldn't be silenced, that she'd get away with it, would that new information change her view on how social media treated conservative voices? And if not all conservative voices, at least hers. And she said, no, I believe what I believe, and you can't change me. And that just strikes me as the kind of faith position that you guys were talking about a moment ago. And I wrote back to this lady and I said, you know, the problem with what you say is, if you can never be changed, it doesn't mean that your current view is right. It just means that no one can ever show you if you are wrong. And so you get to go on through life, believing what you believe, but never being wiser. And it strikes me that that is what all faith positions are. So maybe I came in late and maybe that's completely irrelevant. And if so, I apologize.
Well, sadly, there did feel like there was a bit of that in this tonight. I was hoping for more sciencey language, like all the data isn't in for this yet, but that there's various options that could explain the phenomena that we witness. Yeah, but not all the data's in. I prefer this one, but this option B and C are also valid, and we're waiting for the data to come in, because I consume an awful lot of sciencey podcasts, and there's often that kind of language in sciencey podcasts, and sometimes podcasts that I listen to will have multiple options for an answer to something, and people will sell their different ideas, and the tagline at the end is usually more data required, and then we're going to find what the answer is. That kind of language was really missing from this talk, which for a talk that was supposed to be a Christian talking about science, I was really disappointed, because the bit that you missed, Andrew, was when it came to the talk about the multiverse. It was literally dismissed out of hand. Oh, I don't believe in the multiverse. And when one of the questions affirmed or asserted that the mathematics points to a multiverse or indicates a multiverse is at least possible, she completely batted that out the way and said, no, the maths doesn't say that.
Yeah.
So she's a professional arguing with other professionals, but it seems to me, and maybe this is me just being uncharitable. So you guys tell me what you think when you interact with
You
Christians.
can't be more uncharitable than we've already been before you joined. Don't worry about it.
Okay, well, rising to the existing bar then, it seems to me that the Christian faith position, I felt this way as a Christian. And Matthew, I think, not speaking for you, but because we know each other pretty well, I think you felt this way. The Christian position, if you're even a little conservative or a little evangelical, if you're just a little fundamental, the Christian position doesn't let you say, I'm still waiting on the evidence for God.
That is true.
It's hard to use scientific language in regard to something that might question whether God did a thing.
Yeah. Well, I think there's not only that, but changing their mind, just to go back a little bit, is actually viewed as a bug, not a feature. We had there was this one guy on one of the boards I was on, and he was surprised to learn that his tirade about how science changes its mind, but he's never changed his mind about his God, was viewed as a bug, not a feature for non-theists. He actually thought that because he's never changed his mind, that would be somehow convincing or somehow a good thing. And he was really surprised when I told him that, non-theists didn't take that as a good thing. So,
yeah, exactly. And that was very much an attitude that I had in my creationist days. I was very much a proponent of science changes its mind all the time, therefore it can't be reliable and you can't trust it. God's word is eternal and is unchanging, therefore you can trust it. And I very much had that attitude, and I'm pretty sure that a significant majority of Christians are very much like that, especially the more right-leaning, evangelical, fundamentalist, missionary type Christians. You're going to find that throughout. And part of the difficulty for me, there are multiple moments of difficulty for me in deconstructing and then exiting. And one of them was this change in mind, that actually that realization and then acceptance of science being self-correcting, and that every new experience is a learning experience, and even being wrong means that you learn something. and all these ways in which science slowly and relentlessly expands our knowledge, and therefore it should be seen as a strength. That the shift in my brain from one to the other took time, and it was difficult for me to get to it. So I get it. It's a problem. And I guess the only thing to do is keep showing people how science has progressed and got better. And so that ultimately and eventually they'll get it.
Yeah, but
we live
when
in
they
a
view
world.
that as a bad thing, though, because science is changing its mind, does that really help?
So I say that again.
When they view that as a bad thing, that science is constantly changing its mind, does that really help, though, to constantly show them that science is getting better?
I think if they see that we're not bothered by that, and that we're excited about learning new things and things changing, that if they realize that we don't see it as a problem, and we're like, yeah, so what? It takes the sting out of the accusation, and then they have to rethink their approach. And that might be that rethinking the approach helps them onto the step of realizing that maybe it isn't the problem that it is. And especially if we show the positives of it as well.
Okay, I'll buy that.
But it's like, for me, it wasn't a quick process. It was very much is one of the multiple painful processes that took time for me to process. So you're not going to do it in one conversation with somebody, but if you can cause them a little bit of cognitive dissonance as a result of your conversation, then you've edged them a little bit further along, and you'll have caused them a bad night's sleep. So count that as a win.
I wonder, I've never asked this of a Christian. I don't think I asked myself this question when I was a Christian. We have all had things that we've changed our minds over in our lives, or at least I think it's an experience we've all had. We thought that some diet was particularly good for us, and we find out later that it wasn't. And so we get to update that notion. And when that happens for me, when I find out that I've done something and I wasn't doing it in the most efficient or the best way I could, however you want to gloss that, I like finding out when I can do something a different way and maybe it's better for me. And so I actually feel good about the process of being able to update my beliefs to match the world. And I don't think I'm that unusual in that regard. If I find out that the food I'm buying for my pets is in fact not the best food for them, and I get to buy better food for them, and then, they lead better lives, I should feel good about that. And here's why I mention it. I wonder what it is about the religious mindset that rejects that thing where very often we feel good if we learn something new.
Well, would you love learning something new if you thought it would send you to hell?
No, but I did love finding out that I don't think there is a hell, and there's no reason to be afraid of it.
There was a time, was my deconstruction learning something new? Now you've got me asking a completely different question, Darren. I'm going to have to park that because I'm not in. I don't think we've got the time, and we're going to go off track if I start pondering on that one. We need to have a casual chat episode where we bat these kinds of questions around and talk about how Andrew and I landed at the position that we are, because we've not actually done an episode of how Andrew and I ended up how we are and where we are doing what we do. So maybe we need to have you back, Darren, to grill us on that conversation.
Yeah, I'd be game for that.
And ask that question, because that's not a question for this episode. But where I am now, I love learning something new. Now, there's one analogy that she ended up on her presentation with before they went to the audience questions, and I'd like to throw it out because I thought it was interesting. Now, you could take interesting to be good or bad. I'm a bit down the middle on that one, but I'd like to know how you two think about it. This is on the subject of miracles, so we've gone off all the other things. Subject of miracles, God intervening in the world today, and her analogy to God doing miracles and changing the laws of nature was like a poet deviates from the laws of poetry in order to be unique and interesting in his poetry. So God will do the same with the laws of nature, and that is how we end up with a miracle. Did you buy that analogy, Darren, did it help you at all, or did you hurt it?
I think the first thing that went through my mind when I heard that was, if science and religion are two separate things, then God cannot change the laws of nature at all, because the laws of nature are thoroughly in the side of science. And so if the laws of nature are changing, science can measure that. For me, she's trying to have her cake and eat it too. She's trying to say that God can change the laws of nature, but God is completely outside of science. I think that's one of the many disconnects that she has in her mind when it comes to trying to protect her religion from her science.
Andrew, what's your thoughts on that analogy?
This is something that bothered me about miracles a long time ago. And I love what Darren had to say. If God and science are two different things, you're really arguing for a God that can't do the things he says he can do. He's incapable of modifying the laws of the universe. But I used to ask myself, Joshua and the long day. Matthew, you'll remember, Darren, I don't know if you know this story, but God, the Israelites are losing a battle, and they cry out to the Old Testament God, and they ultimately gain his ear, and they need enough daylight to win this battle. And God actually lengthens the day. He gives them more daylight. And on the surface, you can tell that story, and it seems like this kind of miracle that just, okay, well, God just did this thing, right? And it's this one little miracle, and he just lengthened the day, and everything's fine. But then I asked myself, relatively early on in my college years, how big does that miracle have to be? Did God slow the rotation of the earth? And what knock-on effects did that have? So what other miracles did he have to perform other than just lengthening the day? Did he, for instance, have to tamper with bird flight paths so that they would still be able to migrate properly? What did he have to do to the other planets in the solar system, if anything? What I'm saying is, a big miracle, it seems like it can't just be this one thing, right? God turns a river to blood in Exodus, right? We're trying to get the children of Israel out of Egypt. And so God turns the river to blood. Well, what knock-on effects did that have? Every organism in that river must surely have died. Well, that we would expect to find some evidence of that event. So if we don't, but you believe that God did do it, then fish had to breathe blood for that period of, you see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
These miracles aren't simple. The taxonomy of a miracle is something I think we really ought to think more about, because it's fine to make a claim. But imagine the science of some of these claims. What did God really have to do to not only have this miracle, but to just make it this miracle and it not have any follow-on effects anywhere in the universe?
Have you seen any of the attempts at mathing the Noah's flood that people have done every once in a while? The amount of water that would have had to been falling from the sky to get the amount to cover all the mountains all over the world.
I did this a while back, actually, on my own. So here's what you can do. You can start by just looking at the average depth of the oceans all over the world. So what happened to all of this water? Did evaporation account for the loss of water? Did God siphon it off? Yes. So there's a book, The Global Universal Worldwide Flood of Noah. If you care to see how young Earth creationists rationalize this, it's about 1,300 pages long. And
well, I mean, it's more than that, because the entire world was flooded, which means the entire world would have been salted, and all plant life and everything would have died. So
Fish.
And most ocean life would have died because pH balances would have changed. Mm-hmm. So it basically
so if it's fresh water, you've diluted the salt water. If it's salt water, you've salted the whole globe.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so then when you say what happened to, so let's say it was salt just for a moment, because that's an interesting one.
Well, the ocean has salt in it anyways, so.
Sure, but when it covers the whole surface of the land, do we have enough salt deposits on land to account for that much water evaporation and leaving that much salt behind?
Well, there would be a layer around the whole globe, like the K2 boundary. There would be a layer you wouldn't have it in pockets like in Utah and Egypt or wherever else the other ones are.
Right.
They wouldn't be in tiny isolated pots. They'd be absolutely everywhere. It's like when Answers in Genesis tried to use disparate legends of floods in various parts of the world to support the story of the global flood. These are all in spotted coastal areas or places by rivers. You don't find them inland in the middle of a landlocked country.
Right. Right. And to ask the opposite question, because we started with salt. So to ask the opposite question, if it was fresh water, and we have essentially diluted the entire, all of the oceans of the world, because, we're not just talking about an inch or two of water on land. We're talking about enough fresh water to cover the tallest mountains on the earth, not to mention pressure. So then you have to ask this question. Where did the salt come from that eventually ended up back in the oceans? Remember, we've diluted the salt over the face of the entire globe. How did the ocean suddenly become this place where ocean life thrived again?
And of course, the answer to all those questions is magic. Because if God's going to magic water into existence for a flood, then he can magic trees and animals and whatever else needed to put things back together.
So what you're saying then is for the poetry analogy to work, it needs to be more than just a twisting of the existing recognized laws of poetry, but a complete mashup of the laws of poetry to the point where the poem that you've written is no longer recognizable as a poem.
Well, not necessarily, because God would magic the poem back into correct order when it was done. So
it's compound magic.
Yeah.
So you started trying to write a limerick and you ended up with a haiku instead.
No, you still end up with a limerick because God magicked it back into a limerick.
All right. Okay.
I am. My head hurts. So
welcome to the pain that you missed half an hour ago.
I guess for me, here's why the analogy ultimately fails. It's fine to talk in abstract or flowery terms about things we love and cherish. But at some point, the problem that the Christian God has is the interaction problem that both of you guys have already mentioned. Just because you can analogize God in free verse poetry doesn't mean that you've explained the interaction. And if you can't explain the interaction, you don't know whether your poem means anything in this case, because what we're actually trying to do is understand the real world.
Well, and you're right. And then the interaction problem goes farther than that, which I don't think most people realize, is that if there is an interaction between God magic and the physical world, that means there's an actual interaction between God magic and the physical world, which means God magic then becomes scientifically testable because we can detect it because there's an interaction between God magic and the physical world.
Yep.
I'm troubled by the epistemology of miracles. I'm troubled by the intellectual idea that there's a God that does things that not only don't we understand, but we can't understand, or that he is just hiding how he does them because he doesn't want us to be like him or to be able to do the things he does. We should be troubled by either of those explanations, or at least, it seems to me, I am troubled by either of those explanations.
Thank you both, chaps, for your time. The fourth and last one is next week. And
what is the subject?
The subject next week is Dr. Jennifer Wiseman on the question of are we alone? So this one's going to be fun. I've already got a question I want to ask about this. If you
want to tease it?
No, because you'll go off again and it'll be another 10 minutes before I manage to finish this closeout. So you're going to have to wait a week. But if I've got the right Jennifer Wiseman, it's the Jennifer Wiseman who was a senior scientist with NASA on the Hubble Space Telescope. So maybe this one will actually deliver better on the promises that it dangles before us. So until next time, it'll be a week for us. It might only be 5 minutes or less for you, dear listeners. But until then, stay reasonable.
I have opportunity, I'm still involved with my research group in studying how stars form. And in fact, star formation is still a very vibrant and active process in our galaxy and in other galaxies. Probes are being designed to go to Europa, which is, as we mentioned, the moon of Jupiter, and it appears that Europa has an ocean under its icy crust, and it would be really, really interesting to study that water. You can tell from sunlight that comes through the outer parts of that planet's atmosphere on its way to our telescope, you can tell what that atmosphere is composed of, because the atmosphere will absorb some of that starlight in very precise colors or frequencies, and it's that pattern of absorption that gives us information. Could there possibly be life? And if so, how would we actually know that? And would we actually have a chance to have any meaningful interaction with other life? These are all scientific questions that also fertilize richer questions. Science is not the right tool. In fact, it wasn't designed to answer these bigger questions of, is there a purpose? How do I live my life? Are evil and good really real? Is there a God? Can I communicate with God? And so the region around those stars where you can have comfortable temperatures, and for various reasons we think that life needs to have some capability of having liquid water. Simple life arose rather early, so that's encouraging. Maybe life is robust, and however one believes it starts, maybe it's not so difficult using basic components that we find on planets like Earth. Our Earth is very comfortable for life, and you could think of it as a chicken and egg thing. Are we here because the Earth is perfectly designed for life, or are we here simply because this is the only kind of life that could exist on this kind of planet? There's lots of these larger questions that, if the universe were just slightly different in some of these physical constants, we wouldn't have a chance to be here. And that's an interesting observation. Is that some kind of evidence or even proof of a divine entity? And I really hesitate to go down that path. I don't think looking for evidence of fine-tuning, at least for me, is a satisfying way of trying to prove that. Because if it turns out that next week we find out through physics that actually those fundamental constants of the universe don't have to be really fine-tuned, I start with an understanding that God is responsible for the universe, whatever's out there, and then science teaches us the details. I hesitate to say that one finding or another in science is more indicative of a God behind it all. I will say that what we're learning in science and what we're observing in the universe deeply enriches my appreciation of God and my faith life. But we all know there's something fantastic about the universe, and for a person of faith, that's declaring even more glory about the God behind it. And I'm not the first person, of course, to wonder if there is advanced life elsewhere. Do they have the same questions? Do they have the same problems? Do they have the same thoughts? Do they acknowledge the same God? The bigger questions of why is there evil at all? And why do we recognize it? If this is just natural, then why are we troubled when children are abused or when trouble comes? So in some sense, science is a strong friend of a religion of love and peace. Would God need to do the same thing on other planets with other life? God of the Bible is responsible for everything, whether there's a multiverse, whether there's lots of other planets with life. Nothing is a surprise to God. If there's life beyond, we don't know. God hasn't told us whether they need that same kind of redemption. Maybe God could make a relationship with them in some other form or some other way. Jesus once said, I have sheep that are not of this flock that I also need to attend to. And that could have meant other people on other parts of this planet, but it could also mean other kinds of life. It mentions every once in a while offhand that God has covenants with other animals on this planet. If there's life beyond Earth, certainly God is relating to them in the ways that they need, and it would not challenge the Christian gospel. That's what we need for planet Earth. since life on this planet seems to be very robust and simple life seems to have started on this planet early on, I wouldn't be surprised if there are other planets in this universe where God has endowed it with the kinds of forces and the ability for heavier elements to develop and create the conditions needed for life, that however life got started here, that God could enable life to start many other places. I don't know whether life fills the universe, but I tell you what, since the God that I understand from Scripture has enabled all kinds of life to flourish on this planet, in the oceans, in the deserts, in tropical rainforests, even in icy cold places, interesting life, weird life, joyful life, then it wouldn't surprise me if that same generous God that's created a universe with 200 billion galaxies in the visible part of the universe and maybe an infinite number of others wouldn't have used those same endowed properties of the universe to enable life to flourish. It would be too much for us to comprehend. So perhaps God is being kind by just giving us the ability to learn little pieces of information at a time about our greater universe.
And we're back for the fourth and final episode of the Christian Evidence Society sessions. This time it's the fascinating subject of, are we alone in the universe? A question which unfortunately wasn't really meted out, investigated, pulled apart, whichever set of adjectives you want to know. It wasn't pulled apart in the kind of detail that I would have liked it to have been. And the Christian related questions and thoughts that then follow from that. But it was certainly an interesting discussion, heavy on science, light on theology, always the way I like it. But there we go. So, chaps, what did you think of Jennifer Wiseman and the discussion this time?
Is that a serious question?
Yes, the audience wants to know because they haven't been subjected to the past hour like we have.
It's the same one he asks every time. You should be prepared at this point.
Yes.
Okay,
Absolutely.
so I did.
So were you waiting for the intro? No. Welcome, Darren. Welcome, Andrew. I'm not going to ask how you are, Andrew, because I know I'll get a 20-minute Windows rant, so we'll just skip that. How are you, Darren?
Well, I'm vertical, so that's always a good start to the day.
Excellent. Right. Okay, good. Right now, back to the question. How was the last 50 minutes for you two?
I was subjected to it.
Yeah, I don't know. It was I thought her science was fun. She had lots of pretty pictures what the different telescopes sort of brought to the table. And then it was like she completely, and I don't mean this in a pejorative way, but I guess it's going to come out this way, but it's like she went completely brain dead once the religious questions started coming out and just started parroting whatever she was told at church.
Yeah, it was really weird that you interpret it slightly different to me. I loved the science bit, and she clearly is very comfortable in presenting and talking about science. But I got the impression that answering questions of religion and connecting religion to her science was something that she's either not familiar with or not comfortable doing, or probably really doesn't even want to do. Either inexperience or lack of enthusiasm, call it whatever you want, came across.
Yeah, I could see that.
Andrew, did you have the same impression?
I'm not sure that this is tough for me. I got the sense from her that there's a hard barrier between the scientific work that she does and the religious views that she holds. She said, hey, the science I do deepens my faith. But she never explained how that was done in any meaningful way.
Yeah, that's true.
So I have no idea why she's a Christian. So, look, let me let you ask the next question, because we're going to get into her statements about science and Christianity. And I have a feeling that the fine-tuning comment is somewhere on your list. So
that is my takeout comment from the evening, and we probably may as well just go straight for that, because I also got the impression that Nigel, the very able and elegant host of all these 4 sessions and the 5 ones that we did last year. I felt that this was a subject he was least prepared for, either because he doesn't have the knowledge gap for it. Sorry, there is a knowledge gap, so he just doesn't have all the right knowledge and the questions to ask on this particular subject of what's up out there, or maybe he didn't have enough time to prepare. But he's had to prepare for many different people and a variety of subjects, so I'm going to cut him some slack on that. He can't be expected to know everything, but he let her talk quite a lot and expend a lot of words going around the houses in answer to questions which could have been answered much more succinctly. And he didn't start onto the audience questions until 10 minutes from the end, where I was already getting jittery, thinking, why hasn't he got onto the audience questions? So we only had 3 audience questions, and he didn't ask his usual selection of probing questions. So from that aspect,
boy, were there some.
Yeah. So from that aspect, I'm quite disappointed from the evening, but it was also science heavy, and she showed some pretty pictures, as Darren has already said. So from that aspect, I'm really satisfied. Yeah, let's really go for the fine-tuning one, because Nigel asked about fine-tuning and evidence for design. And Jennifer really cleverly batted, well, I'll let you guys interpret the meaning of cleverly, but she certainly batted that one away. And she said that looking for evidence of fine-tuning is not satisfying for her, because science over time finds that some ideas are wrong. The first idea is usually incomplete, or worse. I'm paraphrasing here. And so science will improve its ideas of things or find new information. And so the first idea is usually shown to be wrong. The classic example of that is Newton's ideas of gravity being replaced by Einstein's ideas of gravity. That's the kind of thing that I'm talking about here. So she said she doesn't like to go down that road. She finds it unsatisfying, and then completely shot her foot off with the next statement by saying she starts with an understanding that God is responsible for what makes the universe.
Oh boy, did I ask that question too. Did both of you fire questions into the void at that point? Because I did.
I didn't at that point. I did a bit later, but I thought I'll just calm down from that one, because I've got a long line of exclamation marks in my notes at that point.
Darren, so, you were going to say something. What were you going to say?
Oh, I was just going to say, no, I didn't bother with any questions this time around.
It was a bit of a head thump response, really. I thought, here we go. Here is somebody who's an intelligent scientist who clearly talks eloquently about matters scientific. And then when it came to that particular thing, does the same thing that all amateur Christians do, which is assume that God exists from the beginning and then work everything out from there, and doesn't even bother with the question of how do we establish that assumption from the beginning. And it was really, really disappointing.
I've got a question for you two. Looking back over all 4 of these, did you get the impression that, I didn't really notice it until this time around, but did you get the impression that all the speakers were given talking points that they had to go? Because there was that question there that God was the underlying thing, which was pretty much echoed through by all the guests. There's the one that the Bible doesn't tell us how the universe works, but why we should, which was echoed by all the guests. And there were a couple more that I sort of noticed, but I didn't write down. Just wondering if you guys got the same impression that I did, that they were all sort of given the same talking points that they had to input in at some point.
Yeah, it felt very much like a statement of faith. Christian colleges are famous for this. If you're going to be on the faculty at a Christian college, you've got to sign this declaration of faith, without which you lose your employment. And it did feel like there was some kind of declaration of faith coming out each week.
That observation wasn't even on my radar, Darren, so I'm going to have to go back and listen through them again and see if that pops out for me. Genuinely a thought that hasn't occurred to me, so I don't really know. I don't know how to answer your question.
I didn't even really notice it until today, because I wasn't looking for anything like that. Looking back at my memories over the last 4 episodes, it just sort of struck me that they all sort of answered the same way to the same questions.
Mm. Matthew, coming back to fine-tuning, I said I fired a question into the void when she threw fine-tuning under the bus. And just so the listeners know, here's the question I fired into the void. By the way, the void they do these meetings on Zoom, and Zoom has a questions and answers feature. When you ask a question in the question and answer in the Q&A section of Zoom, you don't get to see everyone's questions. And once your question is launched, they may see it, but they may or may not pick your question up and ask the guest to answer it, because of course they get lots of questions and they're not going to answer every one. So what good guests try to do is to ask questions that are right on topic. When she said she didn't think that fine-tuning was a particularly good vehicle for exploring whether God had something to do with the formation of the universe, the question that I asked was this: how did you reach the conclusion that God is responsible for our universe without science like fine-tuning? I still want an answer to that question.
Hang on a minute. Did you just say science and then fine-tuning?
She was willing to accept fine-tuning in the category of science. I'm aware of it. I'm not responsible for it. So when I say science like fine-tuning, I might also say science like young earth creationism. If I was talking to Ken Ham, it would be pejorative. But the question would still stand, right? If you don't think fine-tuning can get you closer to God, what science does get you closer to God?
Yep, that's a straightforward and valid question. And this goes back to a comment that I said when we were doing our response to Braxton Hunter's response. Christians don't like to talk about science discovering God. You know, they like to put God outside of that box, while at the same time trying to affirm that Christianity and the claims of Christianity are compatible with science. We're straight into that problematic area, and I don't think there's any Christian who's going to satisfy us with any answer that they give on that, because they're always going to trip over that. Which button do I press? You know, science is compatible with God, or God can't be detected by science, because you can't press both of them, but they will try.
Her connection between the science and God seemed to be one of incredulity when she was going on about the problem of evil and how we recognize evil, and could we do that if it was just synapses in the brain. So it was like she can't imagine how that could possibly be. So God. And I think that's how she connects the two.
That touches on an interesting dichotomy, which I noticed, because when she was talking about the science, which was for way more than half of this talk, it was enthusiastic and it was detailed, and you could clearly see there was an enthusiasm for the subject that she studies.
Mm-hmm.
But then she threw out this subject, which a lot of Christians throw out as well. But she said, the more I learn, the more my faith is enriched. It's like, great, yeah, I've heard Christians say that lots and lots of times. Give me an example. You're capable of talking enthusiastically and eloquently about science. Show me how that connects to your faith directly. What is it about those things that you are learning, those stars out there, the nature of planets, the light that comes from them, the age of planets far away, the composition of the chemical composition of the water on Europa, all those things. What is it about those things that enriches your faith? And no one ever answers it in detail. It's just thrown out as a blanket statement. You know, all the aged Christians nod sagely at how wise it is, and then they move on. It really is a look at the trees argument, and it really bugs me.
It should bug you, because Darren, this had to bother you. I can't believe you didn't fire at least 42 questions into the void over this. So she says, well, you know, science answers the how, what, when, where questions, but science can't tell us anything about purpose and meaning. I was thinking to myself, when she talked about purpose and meaning and value, I was thinking, Darren's going to have to buy a new keyboard. and you didn't send a single question, man. You just
It's the same talking points they've been putting on throughout the entire thing. Every single guest they've had on this in this series has said the exact same thing. The Bible is not a science textbook. It doesn't tell us how, but it tells us our relationship with God. It's just that same, almost verbatim. Every single one of them has said the same thing, and there's only so many times you can hit your head against the table when they say something that utterly stupid. So
Yeah.
this sort of thing, this big talking points idea, was joined with the idea that Christians get to talk to God. She talked about prayer a couple of times. And so I asked this question. I shouted it into the void 3 times through the course of this lecture, event, talk, whatever you'd like to call it. When she said, we can pray and talk to God, I asked, if a person can talk to God, in what way is that communication immune from scientific investigation? And if it is immune to scientific investigation, in what way can one be sure that you're talking to God?
And it's so easy to test too. I mean, what's the genetic code of a plant that will survive in the desert so we can solve world hunger? Why don't we have a department in the police that's ask God, okay, so what are the most heinous things that are going to happen within the next week so that we can be prepared and take care of it? Why isn't there a wing in the hospital that with people talking to God and say, okay, well, what does she have, so that we don't have to spend months trying to diagnose and then too late she dies of cancer, So
hey, God, just tell me which diet to be on so I can live longer.
Right. Exactly. I mean, what amazes me is that all these people that can talk to God, and yet God doesn't seem to know any more about the world than they do.
Yep.
Okay, Matthew, I'm sorry. That may have derailed your next question.
Well, not really, actually. Well, I managed to get one of my 3 questions asked, and given there were only 3 questions asked on the thing, I think I did all right. But I did ask the question that was teased at the end of the last one, which was, if we were able to make contact with intelligent life out there, should they be evangelized? And that question didn't come up, so we don't know what the answer to that one is. But the question I asked that did get answered, which I thought was essentially a yes-no answer, managed to take several minutes, and there was neither a yes nor a no at the end of it. Do you think the existence of evolved life elsewhere in the universe could be considered as evidence against the Christian narrative of a creator God?
I wondered if that was you. I did. I wondered if that was you. So go ahead. What did you think of her answer? Because I agree that it was a little... well, okay, my goodness.
Well,
she threw a lot of stuff against the wall.
Teaser, because my ramble won't be as long as hers, but I'll drop a teaser. She did manage to genuinely surprise me in something that she said. But she started with the trope, God is responsible for everything. Okay, so I guess you could take that as a yes. But then she carried on talking and talked around a few things. And then just as she was finishing up, she then threw out, and the Bible suggests that God has covenants with other animals on this planet. And I was like, what?
Okay, before you do that, because I want to go there, I want to talk about something she said before that in her answer. I think this was before that. Okay, reroute this if you need to. But what I thought she said before that was, and maybe I've just got the timeline wrong, is that if there are aliens out there and God needs a covenant with them, maybe he has a way to have a different kind of covenant with them than he has with us.
Yes, she did say that. Yeah, she left it open for visiting aliens to have a different religion.
So here was this. Oh, I couldn't even shout into the void anymore. I'd gone hoarse. I couldn't fire any more questions.
Oh dear, your poor family and your poor neighbours and your poor people across the street. They're just recovering from the boom.
Yeah, look, it's so much like that. But here's what I wanted to know, and by this time I know I was going to get, I can't get no satisfaction. But here's what I wanted to know. Okay, fine. So your God has other kinds of covenants he can reach with other beings. So let's see. So you're saying maybe women didn't have to be taken as war prizes? You're saying that maybe virginity doesn't have to be the prize on other planets that it is here? Oh, no, I see. All of that's still true. But what you're really saying is Jesus, God's only begotten son, really didn't have to be nailed to a cross and suffer death in order to save everyone? In other words, what the hell are you talking about?
Yeah, doesn't really stand the scrutiny of unpacking, does it?
Well, it didn't in my head. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Well, to be fair, the entire religion is kind of like that, so can't really blame her for that.
Oh no, I can watch. Yes, and
You do realise you're dissing the first 35 years of my life, don't you, Darren?
Well,
I
I'm the gift
can't
that
blame
keeps on giving.
Matthew, did you not have a problem with that part of the answer? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I did. But the bit that she said next gave me more of a huh? So I kind of forgot about it.
Oh, okay, no, fair enough. So the next.
But she
bit is
also
we should
said, what I have got in my notes about that part of her answer was, she did also say, God hasn't told us if they need redemption.
Okay, that's as deeply mystifying. I think I sort of froze up.
Well, maybe they didn't catch the sin disease like we did.
Right, which makes you wonder, right? Because the obvious question is, well, they didn't catch the sin disease. He has pretty good foreknowledge. So why did we again?
Well, maybe we were just the alpha version, and he finally got it right with them.
Satan's hacker army was working against God's computers. And
what I was hoping was going to be a question that was loosely based around science, given that I used the word evidence in my question, and I was hoping it was mostly going to be just a yes or no answer with possibly a little bit of chatter. It managed to end up into a 2-minute ramble on theology. This is a question that I thought about a lot as a Christian, not whether or not other life would be evidence against the creator God, but how we handle as Christians the existence of alien life should we find it. And the conclusion that I came to as a Christian was life on other planets now shouldn't really be seen that much different to 300 years ago life on other continents. You know, for Europeans to get to Asia or Central Africa was an absolute mammoth task, and these were people who had no idea of the happenings in the Near East 2,000 years ago. So the whole narrative of Jesus existing, let alone being crucified and resurrecting, was a complete alien concept to all those people in Central America, Central Africa, India, Northern Russia, Siberia, Australia, you name it. These are places where that whole idea, that whole narrative simply wasn't on their radar because they had their own customs and narratives. And it would be exactly the same for aliens. So why treat them differently? So that was kind of the thinking and the logic process that I went through as a Christian around about this subject.
I don't know that I was ever able to sort this out satisfactorily in my own head. I felt like, as a very fundamentalist kind of Christian, that if there was any God, if there was any life, it must not have been perfect in the same way God was perfect. And I reason this way. Angels didn't manage to make it, and they get to sort of hang out at the foot of the throne, right? So those beings were imperfect. Some of them remain faithful, some of them don't. So free will didn't work in that context. And it was bad enough that God decided to try again with humans, and free will didn't work with us. So I felt like there's something about free will that God wants. What is that? Well, he wants free will worshipers, even if it costs a bunch of free will worshipers that get burned in hell. I didn't say I was a particularly good guy. Just this is my reasoning. And so I felt like if there was an alien species with free will, there had to be a covenant relationship, and that it was probably as fraught as ours is. But the reason I didn't like that answer, it forces anyone thinking that way to wonder, is Jesus nailed to the cross here on earth, his two hands and his 2 feet? If some bugs ascended out in Alpha Centauri, did 6 legs get nailed to their equivalent of a tree, right? So free will seemed to be the problem to me. And free will doesn't seem to work in the Bible for any set of beings that has it. And so if there was life out there in the galaxy that had free will, then there must be a bloody covenant relationship. Pretty awful, I know.
Yeah, it's sort of actually an interesting train of thought, because whenever I hear the stories from the Bible, I always get the impression that God absolutely detests free will. And given what I know about the culture of of how society sort of interacted with the different strata, different classes in society, I sort of get how they came to that conclusion based on the society that they lived in at the time. So I always find it fascinating when people try to use the free will arguments like what you just laid out, how a person tries to balance what the Bible actually says about God and free will and our current 21st century understandings of free will and the values that sort of we have around people and having their own free will. So I guess that's just my long-winded way of saying, yeah, good thought process. I like that.
I wanted to get back to God having covenant relationships with other creatures here on Earth.
Yeah, so
Can we
it's
come
taken
back
a while
to
to
that?
get round back to that one, but let's
Yeah,
catch up on that one.
sorry. Yeah.
I never bought into that one. I know there's people who've written books on the subject. I think one particular book whose title I remember, I think was something like "Will My Bunny Go to Heaven" or something like that. I never bothered reading any of those books on the subject because I was always of the opinion that animals didn't go to heaven. It was humans only. That was where I was on that. Animals were different, humans were better. So that was the line I always took in my Christianity. And now I'm out, I don't really pay a lot of attention to that aspect of it. There's enough to think about and talk about without having to bother about the fluffy edges. But I'm definitely intrigued by this kind of thing. Maybe it's a subject that we could put in on an episode and get somebody on to talk about, but it would have to be somebody who knows and has studied the theology on the subject, because that statement about the Bible suggests that God has covenants with other animals took me by surprise. I don't know where I could possibly find that. I have no recollection of any sermon or anything that talks about that subject. So if I can be bothered, I'll look. If somebody wants to email in about it, reasonpress@gmail.com. But I'm just trying to process how interested I am about this enough to be able to look it up.
David from Red Letters would probably have an idea.
Yes, he probably will.
The Church of Christ view on this subject was this: God gave man dominion over the earth. So it's stated almost exactly that way in the early parts of the book of Genesis, right? So man falls, and that's fine. And that fall impacts all the other creatures on the planet, right? So it impacts the deer and the snakes and the fish and whatever. Here's what we don't see. When God creates any covenant with human beings, we have no equivalent story to God creating a covenant with dolphins, let's say. The reason that lack of evidence is notable is the Bible gives us all sorts of stories about how we're supposed to treat each other. But if there were another covenant species in the sort of heavenly taxonomy, as high as human beings are, you should expect a story about that covenant relationship and how we are supposed to treat the other creatures in that covenant. We don't get that at all.
Well, given Jennifer's sort of ideas around that, if none of the other species had gotten the sin disease, would they need another covenant?
This would place them in the human covenant, though, wouldn't it? So let's say Adam is the one and they just sort of inherit all of our sin.
Well, I mean, if like dolphins never got the sin disease, then would they
I see.
even need a covenant to begin with?
Maybe not, but there should be a story about how we're supposed to interact with perfect beings that never inherited sin. Look at the dolphins. They neither toil nor they spin. They're perfect in every way. Be as the dolphins in your relationship to me. That's sort of poetry.
Well, I prefer bonobos probably to dolphins, but sure.
Sure.
Well, aren't bonobos and dolphins both species that enjoy quite a lot of sex? So clearly they're sinners.
Oh, clearly.
Not necessarily, because I don't think the sex is what makes it a sin, right? Isn't it the thought process behind it?
Oh yeah, but man, haven't you seen? Look, you've seen all these dolphins with those leering expressions on their faces when they're chasing.
That's why they're always grinning.
From a conservative theology perspective, I don't see any justification for the idea that God has a covenant with another species. But here's another problem: covenants are necessarily things that are held between two beings that can understand the covenant. So we obviously, the Christian idea is we can't understand everything God understands, right? But we're not meant to. We're supposed to be able to understand the covenant between us and God, though. What is that covenant? Well, there's an everlasting life. God cares about how we treat each other and about how we treat Him. There are certain duties and responsibilities within the covenant that we have to Him, and if we break that covenant, there's a consequence to breaking that covenant. Now, the real question would be, if God has a covenant with some other set of animals on the planet, let's say dolphins, what would we expect to be able to discover if there was a covenant? What should dolphins understand about it? How would they know if they broke it? And if they did break it, what would we expect to see? How would their behavior change, as for instance, if they felt guilty, right? So a covenant, if you break a covenant, presumably there's some way of knowing and some sort of repentance, right? There's some sort of a guilt feeling. So what species do we watch where we even could deduce that there's a covenant with a God in the way that human beings have a covenant?
I have no idea.
Me either.
Therein lies the problem.
Mhm.
We had an email on the Reason Press email account back in December about one of our episodes regarding the last series of Christian Evidence Society. So I'll just read that email out for you guys to listen to, and we'll see what response we have to that feedback we had from that email. So this is episode 54, where we were talking about the chap on race. We had that episode on race. I don't know how well you two can remember that conversation we had on race from the previous Christian Evidence Society sessions.
Not as well as I'd have remembered it 20 years ago.
But this is the email that I got in relation to that episode. So first time listener here, and I started with number 54, which is the one on race. Seemed to be a couple of white guys agreeing on the premise that most US evangelicals are deeply racist. I strongly disagree. In my circle of white evangelicals, most folks are bending over backwards to choose the trendiest how to be an anti-racist type of literature for their book study groups. One of you claimed that a racist US police response could be clearly seen in the difference between the Jan 6 attack on the US Capitol and the BLM demonstration in Lafayette Park, which had been met by racist riot police. How about if both police responses were severely bungled? Actually, a Capitol police officer shot dead one of the January 6 protesters who's white. No one was shot at the BLM event. Just curious, why did you completely ignore the fact that a female vet was shot dead at the Capitol? I'd say you're either completely ignorant of the two events or else you're guilty of using some Donald Trump-style alternative facts. Which is it?
Well, I can answer the bit about the 30-plus-year-old woman who, when she was shot, she was climbing through a window.
Yeah, it was clearly self-defense. Yeah.
That's right. And not only was she climbing through the window, but she was warned to stop. She was warned repeatedly to stop. Now, had this been a one-off event, had she been climbing through the window and there was nothing else going on, there wasn't a riot in progress. There weren't people who were ganging up on police officers, taking their shields, hitting them with their batons, hitting them with fire extinguishers, and threatening to kill them quite verbally, quite loudly. And mind you, if you think I'm making this up, you can just watch the videos on your own. Now, had this woman been by herself, a one-off invader to the Capitol building, I would probably feel differently about her death. But that's not the environment of January 6th. Do I dislike her loss of life? Yes, I do. I'm not defending that she lost her life. However, she was there with a crowd that was attacking and expressly intended to kill members of Congress and the vice president. Do I rejoice that she lost her life? No, I don't. But she was breaking into the U.S. Capitol during an insurrection, and her blood is not on my hands.
Framing the question that way is kind of a red herring anyways, because I was actually the one that brought that up. The point that I was making was that when the Black Lives Matter protests were going on, they had called, there was hundreds of police on the streets. They had covered, all the monuments and police. And then on the January 6th riots, there was almost no police there. So yes, there was a very different response between the two. And the fact that someone got shot is horrible. BLM protests, they were gassed so that Trump could cross the street and get a photo op in front of a church. So I'm not sure focusing on one death when 4 people died and 140 police officers were injured in the insurrection. And I'm not sure that pointing out those particular differences is relevant to the point that I was making in the first place, which was the initial response to the protest, where BLM response was heavily guarded with tons of police and extra police brought in, and then the January 6 riots, they didn't even bother to bring in police for that.
By the way, I remember now, her name was Ashley Babbitt, and she spent 14 years in the U.S. military. Her military service doesn't mean that she wasn't committing insurrection.
Yeah, there were a lot of vets at the insurrection.
To go to one of the questions,
mm-hmm.
Can we say that both police responses were bungled in both those days? Is bungled even the right word? Both police responses were messed up, badly managed. I mean, what phraseology is worth using here? I'm prepared to say yes to that question. One was over-policed and the other was under-policed.
Yeah, I think bungled I'm sorry, Darren, you've got something to say. Let me let you.
Oh, I was just going to say, I don't think bungled is where the focus really should be. It was how they felt they needed to respond to each of them. Because
that's my problem too.
Yeah, they felt that they needed a strong response for the Black Lives Matter protests. They didn't feel like they needed any response to an actual insurrection on the Capitol, which was full of white people.
On that day, there were pipe bombs left outside Democratic and at least the Democratic headquarters, but something says to me that it was also the Republican headquarters. Don't hold me to that one.
Weren't there people carrying restraints as well?
There were people carrying restraints and people who robbed police officers of their restraints and carried those. I mean, what do you. It's
hard to compare the two events, really, isn't it?
Right. So it is, because in one case, the Black Lives Matter movement was about, and is today, equal enforcement and equal leniency in policing in the United States. To the listener who wrote in, thank you for listening. But if you dare to write back, please tell me, in what way is demanding equal policing in the United States in any way equivalent to attempting to overthrow the government?
Yeah, and our government agencies actually had warned police about the white nationalists at the Trump rallies, so they were well aware of potential violence that was going to happen.
Marjorie Taylor Greene has current video at white nationalist rallies. I don't see parallels here at all, but let's just say for a moment that the author of the email is right. And we should carefully consider that there was one person killed in the insurrection. I doubt that this person that wrote this email would consider an insurrection, but let's say they do. Let's give this the best face. So one person dies in the insurrection. No people die in the Black Lives Matter And to use, I think person used riots. Matthew, is that, do I remember that correctly? Was the word riot used in the email? If you can scan.
Yeah, but it was they were met by racist riot police, so it was riot police responding. So that's where the riot context is.
Okay, so I was wondering if that was a bit tongue in cheek, that the implication was they weren't actually racist riot police, because we're comparing the Black Lives Matter demonstrations to what was going on at the Capitol. But okay, all right. So, no Black lives were lost. Are you then saying what? That because no lives were lost, it's okay to be a racist cop? What exactly is at the heart of that part of the question? That because no lives were lost, police were more fair? If they were, as long as no Black and brown people lose their lives, it's okay to have systemic racism in the United States? What exactly is the point of that part of the question?
Yeah, and it's important to point out that I don't think anyone in the previous episode was talking about racist cops. We were I anyways was just talking about the difference in the response and the systemic racism, not necessarily the particular views of the individual cops involved. Because I mean, they're just doing their job. They're not. If they get called up to guard a statue, they could be racist. They could not be racist. It doesn't matter. They're still going to show up because that's what they were told to do.
Sure.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a clear point to say. Just because the police officers might work for an organisation that has a problem with race perception, it doesn't mean that individual police officers are all racist.
Sure. Though I would also say that it is incumbent on those who are not to do a better job of fighting systemic racism where it is. Mm-hmm. And I think that's been the big complaint of the Black Lives Matter movement. It hasn't been that all cops are racist. It has been that the racism that is there has caused systemic unequal treatment.
And it's not shut down.
Right.
Here in the UK still, we've had cases of Black people in situations like being in the police force or other organisations, and they've suffered racist abuse and they've had to shout it out because the organisation that they're in isn't doing a good enough job of ensuring that it doesn't happen in the first place. So it exists. I don't think we help those people by sending emails like this one, which appear, although it hasn't actually been said explicitly, appear to question the existence of that racism.
Maybe the right thing to do here is to reply and say, hey, let's pick up the mics and talk about it.
Okay, yeah. I hope we've suitably addressed the bit about the racist thing, because it wasn't all about the January 6th event and comparing it to BLM, but that did come up as an example of the kind of systemic racism that is seen in organisations, and we unfortunately suffer the same here in the UK. It's not just America. But there was something else that was said right at the beginning of the email, so can we also clarify our thinking on that? Seemed to be a couple of white guys agreeing on the premise that most US evangelicals are deeply racist. Is that our position?
I don't know most US evangelicals.
Yeah, I would say that whatever the vocal part of the evangelical movement is, that sure does seem to be the crux of it.
And if you're a white evangelical disagreeing with us, then in what way is your view on this subject any better than our white view on the subject? Pick up a mic and have it out. Let's talk about it. Darren, is that something you'd be interested in?
Sure. I mean, I agree that, having a bunch of white guys talk about it is probably problematic to begin with, but
and we did raise that and acknowledge that right at the beginning of the episode on race. But it's true, but I think we are mature enough and self-aware enough that we can recognize racism, and we're prepared to learn about where we're not doing enough. So I think we can talk about it in the sense that saying that white people need to be better, but we can't talk about it in the sense of the lived experience, because I don't think
And if
because
we're
we don't
not,
have that lived experience, but we know people who do, and
right,
we
and
can speak up for them.
if we're not good enough to recognize it, if we're just white people doing white things and we're not capable of recognizing racism and talking about it in any kind of effective way at all, then what good is the question? If we're not qualified to talk about it in any meaningful way at all, if we can't acknowledge racism where we see it, if we can't identify our parts and other people's parts, then what possible hope is there of getting rid of it?
Yeah. There is a point that I'd like to make about US evangelicals. I don't hold the view that most US evangelicals are deeply racist. I'm sure some are, but I have nowhere near enough knowledge to be able to determine how big a proportion that some is. And I will say some, not most, because I don't think it's most. But I do have a problem with the vocal evangelicals that I hear, and I do listen to a few US evangelical podcasts, and I can't think of a single one. So of the ones that I listen to, without question, they are all critical of critical race theory. So if you're not racist, but you don't acknowledge critical race theory, where's the muddy middle ground? That is the Christian Evidence Society sessions for 2022 over. Thank you for listening, dear audience. And as again, if you know of any events like this that are coming up that are being done on Zoom or however, please let us know. We would love to attend them and cheer them up, because then that spares you the effort of having to find some time in your diary to listen to it, and you can listen to us talking about it at your own leisure. And I will do my best to edit it in an appropriate way. Letters to all the usual places, reasonpress@gmail.com. Thank you, the both of you, again, for attending and having this time with me. What we've had to do as a quick note of housekeeping, we did have Darren scheduled to talk about the Youth Alpha course with us, but that coincided with the time where my voice was playing up. So we will try to reschedule that now that we've done these. And so that episode will come up at some point after you've heard this. Thank you again for listening, and until next time, stay reasonable. Thank you, guys. You have been listening to a podcast from Reason Press. Do you have any thoughts on what you've just heard? Do you have a topic that you would like us to cover? Please send all feedback to reasonpress@gmail.com. You might even appear on an episode. Our theme music was written for us by Holly. To hear more of her music, see the links in our show notes.